All right, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the distinguished lecture, the East Asian Institute Distinguished Lecture on Zoom. My name is Bert Hofman. I'm the director of the East Asian Institute, and we're delighted to have Mr. Bilahari Kausikan to speak for us today. I'll introduce him formally in a moment. We're meeting at a time which is a bit more than a year since the Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And of course, that momentous fact has triggered lots of reactions all around the world, and it's still playing out the consequences of it today. The key question for the region is, well, what is China's reaction? What is China thinking about that conflict, and what are they doing with it? But other countries such as North Korea, South Korea, Japan are reacting to that conflict as well. There's no one better placed to enlighten us on those reactions and what it adds up to as Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. Bilahari is currently the chairman of the Middle Eastern Institute, which is an autonomous research institute under the National University of Singapore, just like the East Asian Institute. He is also an advisor to the Korea Center at the East Asia Institute, and the Korea Center has organized this lecture today. He really spent his entire career, well, his career is not over, but his entire professional career was with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. And among others, he was ambassador to the Russia Federation and a permanent representative to the UN in New York. So I can not imagine anybody better placed to shed light on the big questions that we're facing today as he. Before we start, Bilahari will accept questions. I will manage the Q&A. Please use the Q&A button to pose your questions that I can then relay and sometimes consolidate. Thank you so much for joining, and over to Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. Thank you.
Thanks, Bert. That was a far too kind an introduction. I'm not sure I can bring enlightenment to things that are intrinsically murky, but I will let you know what I think in any case. Let me start with a point that some might find controversial. Dangerous as it may be, as wide-reaching in its impact as it may be, the war in Ukraine is, to my mind, a second-order issue. The first-order issue is and remains US-China relations. I think some of you may remember about a year ago, Secretary of Defense Austin said with remarkable candor, but perhaps not too prudently, that the US was going to use Ukraine to weaken Russia so it could never invade another country. Left unsaid, but I think clear enough, because the invasion of Ukraine came only a couple of weeks after President Putin and President Xi Jinping met in Beijing and declared their partnership with no forbidden limits, no forbidden areas, no limits. So the war in Ukraine is, in a sense, intended to be an object lesson to China. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians inadvertently, unwittingly, it was not planned that way, have emerged as something of a proxy in what may be the first US-China proxy war. So was it an object lesson to China? And if so, what was the lesson that China took from it? Well, we can't be sure about China, but it was not just China, by the way. It's also North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and almost every country in the region. But let me start with China. One of the most, the key geopolitical impact of the war in Ukraine has been the revitalization of the idea of the West, which has always been a loose idea, but after the end of the Cold War was in some danger of disintegrating completely. But the West has been revitalized, re-energized. NATO has been expanded. The transatlantic alliance is close. And I think many people, myself included, were surprised, pleasantly surprised, in my case at least, by the strong and unexpectedly strong and cohesive response of Europe. And I And while we cannot know for sure what lessons China took from Ukraine, I think we know what lessons we hope China took from Ukraine. And one of the lessons is, I hope it has led China to rethink its idea of the West. One thing I think Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping had in common was an utter contempt for the West. The West meaning the US and Europe. These were effete countries and in irrevocable and absolute decline. Have they changed their mind? I'm not sure. It is at very least too early to tell. I think Russia at least, and probably China too, still hopes that Europe will break. Just a couple of days ago, the European Union, President of the European Union, made a very important speech, which I'm not attempting to summarize, but I would commend to your attention. And to me, it marks the end of the age of naivete in Europe's engagement of China. What she said was not that they are going to stop engaging China, but they will de-risk their engagement of China. Now, has China understood this lesson? I'm not so sure. As we speak, I think President Macron of France is in China with a business delegation, and there have been business delegations with the leaders of Germany, and there will be no doubt more to come. How is China reading this? China has long had a belief that they are such a big market, nobody can ignore them, and that part is certainly true. Nobody wants to ignore them. But I think, have they taken the lesson that Europe is not a continent in irrevocable decline? China is certainly not a continent in irrevocable decline. Has this lesson been taken by the top leadership in China? I'm not so sure, not yet. I think there's still a hope that Europe will break up, and I think there is a hope that the US presidential election in 2024 will bring a change in US policy. Personally, I think these are forlorn hopes, but what I think is not important. And why I am not so sure they have taken the right lesson is that there is a very profound difference of political culture between China and indeed many Asian countries and Western political culture. And that difference is as follows. History, centuries and centuries of history, have taught China and Russia, for that matter, that good government is strong central government. And even authoritarian government is better than weak government because the consequences of weak government are more horrendous. And that's quite a general attitude, I think, including, to my mind, among a minority, but not an insubstantial minority in Singapore. And framing the conflict in Ukraine as one between democracy and authoritarianism is unlikely to impress anyone except the already converted. My take is that there is going to be a lot of arguments within Europe, within the United States, between Europe and United States in the months and years ahead. Well, democracies are argumentative, but I hope that the arguments will be taken the right way in Beijing and in Moscow, that they will be arguments mainly over means, not over the ends. And of course, the key is how the Ukrainians do on the battlefield. I think a lot of the support that has been maintained is because they're doing much better than anybody could have imagined. But, you know, what will happen? What is doing better mean? What does doing better really mean? What does winning mean in this context? Before I move on to my next point, let me just leave you with a thought experiment. Okay, and later this spring, with all the new weapons Ukraine has been given by the West, it launches an offensive, breaks the Russian line, and looks like it might overrun substantial parts of Crimea. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? I don't think it's so easy to tell. You know, it's not a straightforward situation. How will Putin react? I'll leave you with that open thought. Now, as I said, I commend that speech by the President of the EU to you, where she said we are not going to decouple, I'm paraphrasing, but we are going to de-risk. But will China take a forced circle from continuing engagement by the Europeans of China? Who knows? China is certainly in an extremely awkward position and has been doing all kinds of things not very effectively to try to mitigate the awkwardness of the situation its no limits partnership with Russia has placed it in. But I don't think Russia and China will break. China cannot break with Russia, and Russia cannot break with China for one very simple reason. Neither has any other partner anywhere else in the world of comparable strategic weight that shares their distrust of the West. Now, whether Russia over the long term is going to prove to be an asset or liability to China is another matter. It's still an open question, but I tend to think it's going to be far more of a liability than an asset, but they will not break. I think we can be a bit clearer about the DPRK. North Korea has responded to the situation in Ukraine. It has supported Russia. It has reportedly supplied ammunition, artillery shells, and other kind of lethal aid to Russia. And I think it's not surprising that it would have done so. DPRK has little choice. It has not very many options, and none of them good in the world. As an aside, let me say that I do not think China will be foolish enough to provide Russia with lethal aid. In fact, I don't think it ever had any intention of doing so. But that's another matter. We can take that up in question time if you like. But as far as North Korea and more generally, I think the most serious impact of the conflict in Ukraine is to further weaken, if not fatally weaken, the non-proliferation treaty regime. It was not in good shape in the first place, and perhaps it's a bit premature to consider it dead, but it's certainly in the ICO, and the prospects of recovery are not good. One of the things that has always been puzzling me is the Budapest Memorandum. Why was it that Ukraine thought that it was a good idea to give up its nuclear weapons in return from security guarantees, the most important one of which was from the country that is obviously its major threat? Now, that's a mystery that I have no answer to. No doubt it seemed a good idea to Kiev and the other signatories to the Budapest Memorandum at the time, but I think we now know better. The implication of this is, I think, that if anybody in this audience or anywhere in the world really thought that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was a practical proposition, well, I think you better think again. And if you still think that North Korea can be somehow coerced or persuaded to give up its nuclear weapons, well, all I can say is I can let you have a bridge, really cheap, friendship prices. Actually, on second thought, perhaps it would be rather cruel to try to sell you a bridge, because if you think that North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons, you are obviously hallucinating and you are in urgent need of a psychiatrist. To North Korea, the possession of nuclear weapons is an existential issue of regime survival. And you really cannot provide any cost or any incentive to North Korea that is greater than the cost of giving up their nuclear weapons. So how do you deal with it? You deal with it the way you deal with all nuclear weapon states, by deterrence. Some of you may remember a few years ago during the Trump administration, Kim Jong-un was getting a little carried away the lack of effective Western response, I think, during the second Obama administration and to all his missile tests. And he threatened to bracket Guam. Trump responded by threatening to rain fire and fury on Pyongyang. And as far as I know, since then, North Korea has never tested a long-range missile on any trajectory that took it anywhere near Guam. So deterrence does work. Deterrence is essentially a very crude thing that if you do something I don't like, I will kill you. And believe me, I will. Maybe Trump did it by accident, but anyway, it seems to have worked. So you will have to strengthen deterrence. And for Japan and South Korea, I think there are two very key questions arising from this. Not just Ukraine, of course, but from the North Korean nuclear program, and more essentially from the Chinese nuclear modernization program. What is the future of extended US deterrence? How credible will it be? Can you deter a nuclear armed state by conventional means? I kind of suspect that both of them in their inner councils have come to a decision on these questions already. And Ukraine is an additional push in a trajectory that they have reluctantly, I think, more reluctantly in the case of Japan, less reluctantly in the case of South Korea, already decided upon. Many years ago, a comparable situation arose in Europe, and the late Charles de Gaulle asked the question, will New York be sacrificed to save Paris? The answer was obviously no. And some comparable question, will San Francisco or Los Angeles be sacrificed to save Tokyo or so? I don't think the answer is going to be a resounding yes. So I think both the ROK and Japan are on a trajectory that will eventually, I can't predict a time frame, make them nuclear weapon states within the American alliance system, just as France and Britain embarked on that course many decades ago. I'm not saying it's going to be easy for them, maybe a bit easier for Korea, South Korea, because I think opinion polls show overwhelming support for it. It's going to be very difficult for Japan, politically difficult, and I don't think either are eager to become nuclear weapon states, but the logic of their circumstances will take them in that direction. And it's not just Northeast Asia, by the way. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear that as early as, I think, 2018, Mohammed bin Salman said, well, I don't want to become a worse to the effect. I don't want to become a nuclear weapon state. But if Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state, I will not be far behind. And they have been taking steps in that direction. And the recent deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia has not changed that essential dynamic. Now, what will be China's response be to all this new trajectory in which I think at least South Korea and Japan may be on? Well, I think they will acquiesce in it because the alternatives are all worse. They are certainly not going to mitigate or give up their nuclear modernization program. Why should they? It's a key interest for China, and that's not something they should give up. And I don't think they can dissuade or persuade Pyongyang from giving up its nuclear weapon program. As I said earlier, to Pyongyang, this is an existential issue. So there is no cost anybody can impose on them that is greater than the cost of proceeding. In effect, if you are going to stop Pyongyang from proceeding on its nuclear weapon and its ICBM program, you have to effect regime change. And I don't think anybody is prepared to do that, and certainly not China, for a variety of reasons. I now come to my very last point, and that is on Taiwan. This is the key point, actually. When we say, or when I speculate that Ukraine is meant as an object lesson for Taiwan, I think that is directed against the possibility of object lesson for China. I think that is directed at the possibility of changing whatever Chinese intentions may have on Taiwan, kinetic intentions. Now, the Chinese have said over and again that Ukraine is a different issue from Taiwan, and I think they are right. They are right in its details, and they are right in the core underlying concern. But will it change China's calculus over Taiwan? That I am not too sure. Mind you, I must say that I don't think, let me rephrase that. While China will never forswear the option of forceful reunification with Taiwan, I don't think that is its preferred option. Despite all its fierce rhetoric, I don't think China is keen to launch a war to reunify Taiwan. The risk over Taiwan is war by accident, not war by design. By war by design, I mean war as an instrument of policy, such as the kind of war Putin launched and completely botched against Ukraine. Why do I say, perhaps counterintuitively to some of you listening in, that I don't think forceful reunification is China's preferred option? Well, first of all, I think right now China lacks the capability to launch an amphibious operation against Taiwan. Of course, they can destroy Taiwan tomorrow. Well, what's the point of reunifying with a smoldering rock? Of course, over time, they will develop the capability, but capability has two aspects to it. One aspect is the hardware that they can build. That's the relatively straightforward aspect. But the other aspect, and the more important and perhaps the more difficult aspect, is the software. China has no experience of amphibious warfare on this scale. In fact, no country in the world has any experience of amphibious warfare on this scale except the United States. And the last time they did such an operation was quite a long time ago. I'm referring to the Incheon landings during the Korean War. So even when they develop the hardware capability, it's going to be an immense gamble for China to launch a war against Taiwan. And it's a gamble they will not take lightly, because while Putin can probably survive the mess he has made in Ukraine, I do not think any Chinese leader can survive a botched operation against Taiwan, and probably even the roots of Communist Party rule will be severely shaken. And why do I say that? Because Taiwan is part of the China dream by which the Communist Party legitimates its right to rule. But there are, I think, we should not forget, I think, two sides to the Taiwan Straits. There is the mainland side, the People's Republic of China, and there was the Taiwan side. And I think it's also worth asking ourselves, what lesson has Taiwan taken from Ukraine? There are two scenarios, I think, in which even if China thinks it's going to lose, it must fight over Taiwan, because no Chinese leader can survive not fighting under those two scenarios. The first scenario is a very low probability but high impact scenario. And that is if Taiwan revives the nuclear ambitions it had in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Taiwan had begun a nuclear weapons program with the help of Israel. And then the Americans found out about it and stepped on both of them and said, stop it. Right? I'm pretty sure, in fact, I know that Taiwanese ambitions in this respect have never gone away. And I'm not so confident now that an American president, the wrong or right kind of American president, will necessarily react in the same way as the Americans did in the 1970s. As I said, the probability of such things happening is very, very low. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being high probability, it's less than 0.001%, but it's not zero. But if there is some credible evidence that Taiwan has revived a nuclear weapon program and may be in reach of getting a nuclear weapon, worse still, China must fight, because a nuclear armed Taiwan means the end of the China dream, which requires reunification. The other scenario, which is unfortunately not so low probability, is of Taiwanese domestic politics taking a turn that that will lead to China needing to take kinetic action. I don't think there's any Taiwanese politician that is so daft as to unilaterally declare independence, but Taiwanese domestic politics is extremely volatile. And I don't think whoever is the next president will be as good as Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai Ing-wen has been extremely skillful in navigating red lines while expanding Taiwan's international space. And the red lines are extremely difficult to navigate because I don't believe they are clear to anybody, including China. But over the long time I've been looking at Taiwan, I've perceived two trends which are rather disturbing to me in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics. One trend is a decline over time in the Taiwanese will to defend themselves. Some years ago, during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, there was a training accident and a Taiwanese conscript was killed. That's tragic, of course, but the hard fact is, if you train properly, training accidents will happen. There's just no way to avoid training accidents except not training. And that's unfortunately the course that the Taiwanese did. They reduced their period of conscription to 4 months. Now, those Singaporeans in the audience who have done national service and served in the armed forces will know that 4 months is just about enough time to teach a soldier not to shoot himself in the foot. All right. They are now debating to increase the period of conscription to a year. But I'm not entirely confident that the shock of Ukraine has fundamentally changed Taiwan's attitudes towards defense. Because there is another trend that I've observed over a long time. As the will to defend themselves, in my view anyway, has declined, there has been an increase in the Taiwanese sense of entitlement over the same period. Entitlement in the sense that the argument goes somewhere like this: I'm the only Chinese democracy in the world. Therefore, somebody must help defend me. And nowadays, I'm the only Chinese democracy in the world, and I have chips to boot. So definitely somebody should help me defend myself. Now, helping defend yourself and defending you on behalf, without you doing your bit, are two different issues. And I am not quite sure where the balance will finally lie. But certainly the intersection of these two trends in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics is rather disturbing to me. In the meantime, of course, the risk of conflict is mainly not by war by design, but an accident getting out of control. And I think that risk has slightly risen. It has got nothing to do with Ukraine per se, but it has slightly risen. Now, I'll end here, Bert, and happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much. This was very insightful and, as usual, quite provocative in some areas. And we have already a couple of questions coming in. Please use the Q&A button if you'd like to ask a question. But let me start with one of my own, because you do mention Europe, and yeah. I'm still European, even though I've been based in Asia for more than 30 years. I mean, I was also struck with the speech of von der Leyen, and basically, they turned much more hawkish. Yeah. And even though individual countries still have their economic interest, but clearly the leadership in the EU is much more hawkish, as taking the lessons from Ukraine. And so China's position vis-a-vis Russia and their unlimited friendship has a real cost in terms that they are losing Europe. And I'm using the continuous tense because I don't think that is necessarily a done deal. So my question is really: is China missing their moment? Should they lean more on Russia to make peace on Ukraine terms, or make peace on reasonable terms in Ukraine, and spend some of that friendship capital that China has with Russia? There seem to be, right now, the definition is sort of, Evan Feigenbaum called them pro-Russia neutral. I think that's a little bit unfair, but they don't seem to be very keen to address the real issues, aside from giving general principles. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think I mentioned it in passing that I don't think they have any choice, because they don't have any other partner anywhere in the world of Russia, or comparable weight with Russia, that shares their attitude towards the West, right? So it's not that they have a lot of choice there. Secondly, I think, what is the Chinese currency vis-a-vis Russia? Can it really be spent? Because, in effect, Russia has lost this war, by not winning it quickly, Russia has lost the war. But can Mr. Putin admit that and remain in office and remain, shall we say, not fall out of a window shortly after, right? I think these are questions that are running not through Mr. Putin's mind, but Mr. Xi Jinping's mind, right? It's quite clear that they have a close relationship because they need each other. I think we all know the Russia-Chinese relationship has historically been an extremely difficult one, but this is one driven by interest, right? And they don't have much choice. So I don't think you can really spend that currency of a partnership with no limits on this commodity piece, right? It's just there isn't enough to pay Putin to contemplate this. On the other hand, the Chinese are going to be very careful about the kind of support. They have been very careful about the kind of support they have been giving Russia. The last thing they want to do with all the problems they have at home is to get entangled in secondary sanctions, right? So they try to do it by smoke and mirrors, by having 12 principles of a rather broad nature, by giving diplomatic support in the UN and other places, and perhaps some non-lethal support, which food, buying stuff, uniforms, I'm told, and things like that. But I think Secretary of State Blinken was being quite clever and devious when he accused China when he warned China against doing something they had no intention of doing. That is to give lethal aid, put them on the defensive, put them on the back foot. And I don't think it's an accident that shortly after that, suddenly those 12 principles, which showed every evidence of being rather hastily cobbled together, appeared on the table, right? But I don't think they can be the peacemaker without breaking with Russia, and I don't think they can break with Russia.
That leads me to a question by Paul Henley, because after von der Leyen has given her speech, she also joins a visit with Macron. Do you believe that China would be keen to mend the fences with Europe? And what would they do if they cannot lean on Russia? What would they do?
No, I think, I find nothing incompatible with making that tough speech and also visiting China. These are complementary rather than, alternatives, right? And I think you and Paul understand that, right? The question is not whether you, I, and Paul understand that, but how the Chinese understand this. Do they see this as a weak link? And in the past, you know this better than me, Bert and Paul. The Chinese always believed that their magic weapon was not just the United Front, but their market, right? And to paraphrase Lenin, these capitalists will always sell us the rope with which we will hang them, right? Okay. But I think something has changed, and that speech was a clear indication of that in the European attitude. Yes, engagement must go on. You must engage a big country like China, but you must engage it without illusions. And the key part of that speech is we are not going to decouple, we are going to de-risk, right? Now, I hope the Chinese understand the nuances and subtleties of this position. My view is that they have not showed great understanding of Europe historically, in the last few years, right? In fact, they misread Europe over and over again, right? And I think the reason for that is one I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, that this difference of political culture. Europeans, Westerners in general, distrust power, therefore disperse power. And that has certain disadvantages because it takes you a long time to get your act together. It can be mistaken for weakness. It often is mistaken for weakness. But, push comes to shove, you can get your act together, as Ukraine has been shown. So unless China is going to substantially change its position on Ukraine, it's not going to be able to substantially improve its relationship with Europe, even though Europe is going to continue to engage China.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you. Frankly, being European, from what I hear, the voices from Europe is that they have really united, and I don't think they can break over the issue of
I
Russia.
don't think they'll break either.
I mean, in that sense, China has some clear choices to make. Let's turn to the region a little bit more. And Samir Puri, formerly with the IISS, asked, well, you talked about the Northeast Asia reaction, but what about the rest of Asia and the Middle East? I mean, they seem to be quite divided, and they seem to, in part, take some opportunities. Singapore has been very outspoken on the war. But others seem to take this opportunity to actually move away from the West, and notably the Middle East, but some other countries in Asia as well. What is your view on that?
Well, I think Singapore is an outlier. I mean, we're a small country. We are allergic, obviously, to big countries, invading small countries just because they don't like their faces or something like that. I mean, that's to be understood, right? I think it was President Macron actually at the Munich Security Conference that warned the West, I think correctly, that support from in the global South for the war in Ukraine is not as strong as you may think it is. In that sense, the votes in the United Nations, which have been overwhelmingly in the support of the West, are a bit misleading, because a vote in the UN is not nothing, but is a vote in the UN, right? It has its own limited importance. Now, why is that so? I think because, look, the principle that has been violated in the Ukraine is clear enough. I think everybody understands that. It's a very immediate principle to a small country like Singapore. It's perhaps not so immediate a principle to larger countries who, by the way, in much of the global South, in the Middle East, in Africa, parts of Africa, even in parts of Asia, this violence that the Ukrainians are enduring daily has been a constant reality for many, many, many years, and nobody has made such a big fuss about it. Right? So now, those of us who have engaged in international relations in one way or the other, professionally for all our lives, understand that the double standard is inherent in international relations. It's not nice, but it's a reality. That is not so evident to many people, and many people in Southeast Asia. Look, I mentioned, in Singapore, the surveys I have seen show there is overwhelming support, 60–70% for what the position of the government has taken, right? But that still leaves a substantial minority who blame NATO expansion, blame Ukraine itself, blame the West, blame somebody else, blame everybody except Russia for the war, right? Now, we may think this is ridiculous, but this is a fact. It is a fact about Singapore that I think many people, Westerners who live here in particular, don't understand, because they interact with a certain strata of Singapore. The Singapore ground is not naturally pro-Western. It doesn't mean we are anti-Western. We are not anti-Western, but we are not naturally pro-Western, right? So, and if that's true of Singapore, which is probably the most westernized of all Southeast Asian countries, what does it mean for Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on, right? So I think there's something to bear in mind, something to bear in mind. The Middle East is a slightly different issue, right? I don't want to get diverted, but I think they have started to diversify their relationships long before the war in Ukraine, right? Because look, the general strategic posture of countries in the Middle East, I don't want to sound condescending, and I don't mean it that way. It was, for the longest time, to look for the strongest external power and hug it, right? Now, what do you do when there are when all the strong external powers do not wish to be hugged, not in the same way anyway? That includes China, right? The Chinese role in brokering that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran is an achievement, but it was not a game changer. The heavy lifting was done by the states of the region themselves, by Oman, by Iraq. And if Saudi Arabia and Iran had for their own reasons, not wanted to stabilize their relationship, there would be no deal in Beijing or anywhere else. We always forget that countries in what was called the third world have agency, you know. These are not uninhabited regions, you know, in which great powers just play their games. The Middle East in particular is a place where the tail more often than not wags the dog.
So coming back to the region, where, as you say, there has been, Singapore was the strongest, perhaps, reaction. But what I see, and you focus on the nuclear non-proliferation issue, yeah. But isn't there a broader arms race in the making? I mean, Japan declared now that they go to 2%. Korea has revisited its alliance with strengthened its alliance with the US. The Philippines has invited the US back in and has just announced 4 or 5 new bases in Philippines, unimaginable in the past 25 years. So we have AUKUS, co-worker, who's also in the audience. He raised a question on AUKUS and now the announced feasible path, which is still quite a long path, but nevertheless it will in the end lead to nuclear-powered submarines in the region. Is that at all a reaction to the war in Ukraine, or how does that play out?
I think these things were underway anyway, right? Ukraine may have been a catalyst in the sense that it may have speeded some things up, right? But it didn't per se created it. I think what Ukraine has underscored is something that has been always more evident in this region than, say, in Europe or some other regions. And that is the vital role of the United States in maintaining a balance in the region. This is something Singapore has never been shy about saying since time immemorial. But I think there is a greater acceptance of that fact around the region. Not so much about Ukraine. Ukraine is underscored this fact. Huh? But I think the fact it was really basically driven about concerns about Chinese behavior. So it would have happened anyway. It may have speeded it up a bit, but it's not the cause per se.
Okay, let's go to a question of Prof. Jong-wook Ryu, who is an associate at the Korea Center, and he asked. So you talked largely about strategic military, but and political. Can you give a view more on the economic ties and what the consequences of the Ukraine war are for the economic ties? I mean, what does it mean to be de-risking, and does that result in economic fallout? How is the U.S. agenda with its measures to contain the technological progress of China? How does that play out for the region economically? Does that have consequences that you see?
Well, I think you know my views on this, Bert. I don't think there can be. I don't think there's some. The U.S. and China are competing within a single system, global system. Neither are very comfortable with that. I don't think this global system can be bifurcated completely into 2 separate systems. There will be partial separation in the areas you mentioned, high-tech areas, to disrupt China's plans, to delay them, and so on. But even there, I don't think you can completely separate the 2 systems. The cost is just too high, and American friends and allies are just not going to play that game. They will play the game up to a point, Holland will stop selling some machinery. Japan has now stopped selling some machinery, some chemicals, and so on. But to separate the whole system is not going to happen. Neither the US nor China are terribly comfortable with this. The US wants to pursue a strategy of perhaps not decoupling, but diversification to spread risk, right? But that's easier said than done, right? Some will happen, some is happening. The Chinese want to pursue a strategy of more self-reliance, right? Greater self-reliance in certain areas of technology, more emphasis on domestic consumption to drive growth. But that's also easier said than done, right? Okay. So for the time being, there will be opportunities. I mean, for Southeast Asia, India hopes to benefit from diversification strategies. Vietnam hopes to benefit from diversification strategies. So Thailand, you can go on, right? How much they will benefit, time will tell, I don't think this is going to be an automatic process. You have to prepare yourself. You have to make sure you have the right kind of workforce with the right kind of skills. You have make sure you have the right kind of regulatory and legal frameworks to welcome these new businesses who may come. But there will be an opportunity. But there's another point here, okay? There's another point here. The war in Ukraine is going to be a long war. We now know it is. That's one of Putin's main miscalculations. I find it very hard to envisage at this present moment any kind of realistic scenario in which there can be a lasting political settlement, right? At best, and I don't think we are close to that either, I can envisage some form of armistice as on the Korean model, if you like. An armistice that leaves Ukraine formally de facto divided, but which nobody will very few countries will recognize the divisions, but and Russia will be in occupation in some form or the other, right? What does that mean? That means sanctions will continue. That means the disruptions of sanctions will continue. That means the uncertainties that are incumbent on the possibility of getting entangled in secondary sanctions will continue. And this is a kind of new norm that all of us will have to navigate.
Yeah, with that, you actually have answered the question that I haven't posed yet.
Okay.
Chi Dong-tao and Sarah Tong, they both asked sort of, what do you see as the end game of
I don't see an end game.
Well, so it means a long war. But
a long war, and best you can have an armistice. No, I posed a thought question in the beginning, and I'll just repeat it. Let's say Ukraine breaks the Russian line and looks like overrunning Crimea. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Not so easy to tell.
Well, I mean, there is one thing, and I know that would be very uncomfortable for China, but the collapse of I would say the Putin regime.
Putin regime, right?
I'm not saying Russia, but the
no, but you see, I tell you, I mean something different. One of the things, Putin has already lost, frankly, by not winning quickly, he has already lost, but he cannot admit that, right? What would he do if it seems that the Ukrainians might retake Crimea? Now, the annexation of Crimea was genuinely popular in Russia, even among people who had no particular love for Putin, because most Russians, if you ask them, will say that God knows why Khrushchev gave it away in the first place, right? So it's not so easy to. I don't think the political conditions are right for a lasting settlement, and a lasting settlement must entail some exchange of territory or some territorial concessions, one way or the other. I don't see how Mr. Zelensky, having asked his people to make immense sacrifices and they responded so heroically, can now turn around and say, well, chaps, actually, we need to give up this bit of our country or that bit of our country, right? Politically. On the other hand, I said Putin has already lost, right? But how can he say, all right, all right, after a year of war, we will end up where we started, with Crimea and with Donbass, and 200,000 dead and God knows how much material sacrifice. How can he do that?
Your armistice solution is not a solution.
It's not a solution.
Even that is a temporary.
Temporary, but the Korean armistice has lasted how long? Temporary.
A very long time, yeah. So I said the other alternative would be the collapse of the Putin regime, which
brings its own problems. Because we should
agreed.
We should not assume that Mr. Putin's immediate replacement will be better than him.
We go to a question of Dr. Lam Peng R. Is the dispute in South China Sea, intensifying as a consequence of the Ukraine invasion and the enhanced competition between China and the US?
I don't see it, actually. I think the level of competition is more or less the same, and the Chinese now, given the difficulties with Europe and other countries, trying to make nice with the ASEAN countries, and talking about a code of conduct again. Now, the code of conduct is not going to solve anything, and I don't expect it to be concluded anytime soon. But I don't see that the South China Sea is any worse than it was before Ukraine.
Mm.
Not better either, by the way, but not worse.
That's worse. Very good. And what about Japan? I mean, Japan seems to, and Peng Hui Yap has a question on that. Japan seems to be acting more assertive now against China and behave more like a normal country. And I mentioned the doubling of the defense budget that was announced. Is Japan taking the opportunity of the conflict in Ukraine to be more assertive?
No, I think Japan has made that decision long ago, that the Yoshida Doctrine, which was the fundamental basis of its foreign policy and strategic policy, was obsolete. And that decision was taken by the late Mr. Abe, and he worked systematically, particularly in his second term, to put it into effect. And what we are seeing now is the denouement of things Mr. Abe started, right? As I said earlier, I think Ukraine may have been speeded this up a little bit, but it didn't fundamentally create this new trajectory for Japan. This new trajectory for Japan, if it was created by anybody, it was created by Mr. Xi Jinping, and Mr. Abe took advantage of it to move Japan in a new direction.
No, we're talking to some extent of a long war, and so these issues are going to be with us for a very long time. What do you think in the long term, what will change in the region? I mean, one of the factors is, of course, China. Will China change its position vis-a-vis Russia over time, say 5 or 10 years from now? Or is this more a Xi-Putin relationship, or is it truly structurally China and Russia? And what would be the consequence of that for China's behavior in the region?
Okay, now if I was China, I would try to move to a less partisan position, so I can be the kind of balancer between the US and China and Russia. It's a bit puzzling that they have not done so, but I think it's because of things that things that China did before the war in Ukraine that have created a certain path dependency, political path dependency, right? So I think it's going to be difficult for them to shift, right? So no, over the long term, China is a geopolitical fact, it's a geoeconomic fact. We'll have to deal with it. There's not as if anybody has a choice, right? You may have concerns about Chinese behavior. I know of no country in this region that has not got concerns about some aspects of Chinese behavior, right? Simultaneously, I know of no country in this region, including close American allies, that do not have some concerns about some aspects of American behavior, right? So I think you put these two things together, you have to deal with both US and China. And in fact, I think there's a better appreciation that dealing with both simultaneously is the necessary condition for dealing with either effectively, right? But you have at the same time concerns about Chinese behavior and concerns about American behavior, right? The concerns are not the same and they are not held with the same intensity, but they exist. So you put these two facts together, what do you get? I think over the long term, you're going to see countries. The immediate effect is AUKUS, it's the Quad, it is strengthening defense budgets, and so on, right? But the long-term effect is going to be to seek more strategic autonomy to pursue your interests independently of both the US and China. Doesn't mean that the alliance systems will break up. I am not arguing that, right, at all. But you are going to see people seek more maneuver space for themselves. And I think you're going to see more and more small coalitions of countries forming and reforming around specific issues. Some of these coalitions may, say, for example, include China, but not the US. Some may include the US, but not China. Some may even include both. I don't rule that out. But they are not going to be permanent. They are going to be issue-based. They're going to be a much more dynamic and fluid situation. But that's the long term. I mean, this is not going to happen next week, but okay. But to some degree, it's already occurred, you know. Look, when Trump pulled out of the TPP, it was the late Mr. Abe who took the initiative to form a semi-coalition, all right, which now has got the UK, right? You have the RCEP. These are just economic things. You have AUKUS, you have the Quad, and you have, there will be other things that will develop. I can't predict what will develop, but I don't, for example, I don't envisage a situation where ASEAN will work with the Quad or join the Quad, right? But I can envisage situations where ASEAN might do particular projects with the Quad, for example, on the supply chain resilience or health, which are also part of the Quad agenda. So you're going to have much more fluid situation where, you know, people are not going to necessarily align all their interests across all domains neatly in one direction or the other. They want to choose, they want more freedom of choice, if you like, to pursue their interests in any direction.
Well, I mean, that has always been the argument from, and Li Shanlong has, of course, phrased that very well. But he is actually, I mean, I've done some research myself where you actually see there is not a one-sided economic dependence on China and a one-sided sort of strategic dependence on the US.
No, it's not too simple.
It's far more. It's far more complicated. Right. And but I still find it interesting that the US continues to not play that economic card. I mean, IPEF. You conveniently forgot IPEF.
Well,
maybe because we don't know what it is yet. But
well, it's better than nothing, shall we say?
Right.
But you know, Bert, we shouldn't forget now that the missing American economic card is actually a multilateral card or plurilateral card. Bilaterally, the US is still an extremely important economic partner to most of us, right?
Yeah, it's still the largest investor in the region. It is.
That's right.
If you look at the trade that goes to China, but then ends up in
the trade. That's what I mean by this tangle or competing within a single system. They can't disentangle themselves.
Coming back to that short run, it's really, I mean, it's on my mind, and you addressed it, but in a way you said it is a puzzle. Paul Handler also has a question on that. Why doesn't Xi Jinping just give Zelensky a call? If I were him, I would just do it from optics. As you say, well, it would at least look good to ask both sides before putting out a
peace proposal, so-called, right?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a peace proposal, to be fair. It was principles for peace, which is different.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I suppose he's afraid that if he gives Zelensky a call, and Zelensky will ask him for things that he is not prepared to do, or he can't even do without, you know, damaging the relationship with Russia. I guess so. I mean, if I was him, I would do exactly what you just suggested, you know, for optics, if nothing else, you know. But, you know, when you talk at that level, you know, okay, Zelensky says, all right, you know, why don't you use your, Zelensky says what you just asked me. Why doesn't China use your influence with Russia to make them withdraw, right? So what is he going to say? Oh yeah, I never thought about that. Yes, thank you. I'll do it immediately. And if he does, but it's not going to say that. But if he doesn't say that, Zelensky will say, look, I asked him and he refused, right? So I don't see a great upside tactically for that.
Right. Well, I mean, you would at least have a better understanding of what the Ukraine position is, and as you say, if it's a maximal position, then it's going to be very difficult. Yeah. But I mean, coming back to that long war scenario, and both Charlie Brown has a question here. But if it is a long war, and that's something that ends up in an armistice that may take 50 years, it will be a disruptive element for the next 50 years or for a very long time.
Yeah.
How would that long-term game play out for China and the region, given that their relationship with Europe is affected by it, as well as the regional trends that you spelled out?
Well, when I say a long war, I don't mean a 50-year war, but I mean an armistice may be a 50 years, right? How do wars end? How wars end when one side or the other wins, or both sides get too exhausted to continue, right? I don't think we're anywhere near there. So I think we are and I think politically, if Putin will want to see what happens in 2024 before he starts thinking seriously, if he's going to think seriously, of some kind of solution. If, that's a big if, I think. So we are looking at least for another 2-3 years of fighting. But let's say there's an armistice, right? Both sides fight themselves into a state of exhaustion, and there's an armistice, because it's politically very difficult to come to a definitive solution. Then I think we will just have to adapt around it. We adapted around an armistice in Korea for a long time, and we'll just have to do the same. It's going to be very difficult, because it's going to be immediately very difficult for Europe, because you're right there on the front line, right? It will mean a long-term larger defense budgets, which means long-term less to spend on other things. It means, and that will mean political reorganization or reshuffling of the political cards. It will mean the rest of us taking diversification, resilience of supply chains more seriously. That will create opportunities as well as disruptions. But I think human beings are immensely adaptive, you know, and we will adapt reluctantly, maybe, painfully, certainly. But if it's going to be a long thing, then we must adapt, because what choice is there?
What you see from all of this, and you mentioned in the one of the reactions in the region is if you want a weaponing up, would there be a stronger emphasis within ASEAN, where, you know, ASEAN has two legs? One is economic, but there's a security leg to it as well. It is not that visible, but will that become stronger? Will there be stronger cooperation on the strategic side within ASEAN?
Well, look, I think as far as security concerned, the hard fact is that all of us act primarily nationally rather than regionally. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is quite clear, because historically our main threats are each other. I mean, this is not a happy band of brothers singing in perfect harmony, because if we were that happy band of brothers, there would be no need for ASEAN. But
that sounds like Europe, right? So I mean, Europe also.
Yeah, but you know, Europe, you had 2 world wars, you know, you had a Holocaust, and before you came to this conclusion, we learned a little bit faster, right? Just a little bit faster. So I think there will be more regional consultation on security, but not necessarily cooperation on security, right? But certainly, I think we have always taken our national defense much more seriously in terms of, if you look at, I haven't done the sums, but I think, you know, okay, just take Singapore, look at per capita, how much we spend on defense. Is there any European country that spends per capita that much? I doubt it, although I haven't done the sums, right? That's intuitively. If you take all the East Asian countries or Indo-Pacific countries, we will take that, right? We have always taken defense much more seriously in terms of how much we spend on it and so on. 1 or 2 exceptions here and there, but you know, by and large, that's the general rule, I think. Whereas the general rule in Europe is the other way around. There are a couple of countries that have always taken their defense very seriously, but generally the rest have kind of de-emphasized defense spending, especially after the Cold War, which are now they have to quickly ramp up again.
Right. I mean, in Europe, you will see, I think, very clearly now everybody's committed to the 2%, and that will happen.
Yeah.
It may take some time, but very clearly that is the future we seek. And as you say, the great achievement of Putin is that they have unified the EU and strengthened NATO. So that is reality.
Well, actually, he has done what several American presidents have failed to do.
Right. Correct. Yeah. I mean, look, one of the risks coming to America, one of the risks that you mentioned in passing, but it is, I think, a clear risk. I don't think the risk is Europe sort of becoming disunited on the Ukraine issue. The risk from the US, though, is quite different. I mean, they're explicitly the 2 leading candidates of of the Republican Party, which may not win, but it may win, they have declared that Ukraine is not a very important matter for the US, so they really don't understand why there's so much money is being spent. Is that something that Russia is waiting for and China is waiting for?
I think they are waiting.
That would be
I
the
think they are.
Ukraine war effort.
I think they are waiting for that, right? Certainly, they if I were them, I would wait for that. But I think I will also reserve judgment on that, right? As I said, I think there's a lot more argument to become within Europe, within America, between Europe and America. But I think it will be argument mainly about means, not ends. The argument now is about burden sharing, basically, not about whether we should support Ukraine or not support Ukraine. It's about who's going to pay, what share do we pay, are we paying too much, should Europeans pay more? It's that kind of argument rather than, oh no, Ukraine is not important, so we are going to just abandon it. Nobody is arguing that way, right? So I think we have to be careful about that. But I don't see that there is going to be, at least in the foreseeable future, meaning 5 years or so, right? Fundamentally shift. Nobody's talking about abandoning Ukraine. We're talking about what is the best means, what is the most cost-effective means, who should share the burden, how the burden of supporting Ukraine should be shared. So that's a different kind of argument.
Okay. Look, we've been bombarding you with questions, and you've been very kind to answer many of them. I end with a final question. It's an economic question. Yeah. So I know that it's not necessarily your field, but you've given great insights before. And Yu Hong here from the Institute asked the broader question, sort of what does the geopolitics of this mean economically? And the specific one is the question on international currency and the status of the dollar. Just very recently, some ASEAN countries announced that they would work more together to minimize the use of the dollar. There's been talk of the weaponization of the dollar. China's more keen to internationalize the RMB. Are we going to see a major shift there as part of this partial decoupling, de-risking of the economy?
I think you will see a partial shift. You're already seeing it, but you're going to see it in very specific and narrow domains. Your renminbi is basically being used, if I'm not mistaken, bilaterally in many bilateral deals, right? But however, I find it very, very difficult to see the renminbi substantively replacing the US dollar. In any significant way globally. Look, it's not just China that's worried about it. Charles de Gaulle himself, very long time ago, was very worried about it, right?
Well, he was worried about gold.
Yeah, but look, it was gold. He thought about the dollar as being giving Americans an exorbitant privilege, and so on, right? But it's been such a long time, and it's all easier said than done. I think there has been some shift, but mainly on a bilateral basis, mainly on in rather specific, maybe trading in some specific commodities with a particular country. And I think there are two fundamental problems. By the way, one of the things that amused me because of the Ukraine war, suddenly a lot of commercial financial houses and all have discovered that geopolitics matters. That politics and economics are interdependent, that economics is not practiced ceteris paribus, right? Because other things are never equal, right? So I think, well, that's a good discovery. I hope it lasts. But, look, I think there are two fundamental issues, right? Why I think even the Chinese, while they want to de-risk, minimize the risk to themselves of the possible weaponization of the dollar against them, have to take into account. And they're both fundamentally political, right? One is we must not forget that China is, after all, a communist country, not in its ideology, but in its political structure and in its political values, meaning that the primary value is control of the party. And party's ability to control state, society, culture, everything, right? Economics, everything. Internationalizing the renminbi means to some degree you cede control to external forces. To some degree. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it, but to some degree. And I think everybody knows that, but the US has thought it worthwhile. Right? The other issue is trust. We have seen over the last 10 years decisions taken clearly for political reasons that trump economics in China. Right? So everybody's going to make if you hold your major international holdings in renminbi, and politics in China takes a certain turn, and the party decides to do certain things, where's the recourse? Now that risk is not absent in the US, right? We remember what happened.
The US has been competing on that front, yes.
Huh?
The US has been competing on that front.
Yeah, we remember what happened in 1971 when Richard Nixon did this and overnight blew up the peg, right? But I think the risk is less because it is a market economy and the values are different.
All right. On that note, I would like to thank you very much, Bilahari. This was
thank you for giving me the opportunity.
A great session. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the audience learned a lot. There's still a few questions outstanding, but I think we covered the waterfront. And I think the one thing we conclude on the geopolitical analysts such as yourself, they will not run out of work. They will have more work rather than less in the future. So I hope to repeat this at some point in the future, that we can again learn from your great insights. Thank you so much. And thanks
for inviting me.
Everybody for joining.